Okay, hello everyone. This is the first panel of what is a great and interesting conference, and it is dealing with one of the most pressing issues that will determine, in many ways, the future of the Western Balkans. EU conditionality issues in the Western Balkans. It used to be the case, and in fact, it still is that the Western Balkans had and have as a strategic goal to become full members of the European Union. I think it's fair to say that a consensus has emerged that joining the European Union, despite its various problems and tribulations, is a positive, will be a positive step, a positive development that will contribute to regional stability and prosperity. However, however, the European Union does not exactly have an open door policy. It says, do you want to join? Good, fine. But there are conditions. You just cannot come in and say, hello, we're now buddies and fellow members. And you know what? As we've discussed in previous conferences, their conditions, not only do they exist, but it appears that they are being added upon. We have more conditions now. You want to become a member? Fine. But you got to resolve, we'll hear about this, more and more issues. So the first talk will be by, and actually let me apologize if I mispronounce any of the last names. You can try and pronounce my last name, and I won't be offended if you mispronounce that as well. So, Ivica Bakota, is that correct? Assistant professor at the Capital Normal University. Overcoming the Moses Trap. Strategies to defy the EU conditionality. So two things here. I want to find out, what's the Moses Trap? And are we talking about defiance? I like that, but I want to hear more about it. So the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me on this conference. And greetings from, rather rainy Zagreb. I'm assistant professor at Capital Normal University in Beijing, China. And so usually this time of year I will be there, but due to this coronavirus, we are all kind of set to do this online classes. So I'm here in Zagreb. Basically, my presentation today will be based on this Moses Trap and the strategies to defy this European conditionality toward this Western Balkan countries. To give this is part of a rather larger research that I'm doing, and I'm hoping at least to wrap up the most important part for this presentation. For the context, we can say that after the this European summit in October last year, the French blockade of the start of accession of let's say Albania and North Macedonia, European Union is increasingly losing this normative foothold in the Western Balkans, and it's even said not to show the consensus on this basic issues related to an enlargement policy. So it has been brought up in the last years that the European Union would rather prefer a certain status quo in this Western Balkan countries, regardless of what it means, right? Just like protracting strategy until the first next accession date, let's say. So let's say the absence of this real progress, there has been certain progress, that's for sure, but from this local perspective, the absence of real progress towards the European integration made some of the authors, some of the analysts in the last couple of years to come up with arguments that say that European Union already has lost the capacity or has no any more responsibility to search for maybe certain alternatives in Western Balkan region, that it's not anymore keen to find this political alternatives, or that don't want to be dragged into this alliance with unstable anti-European or Eurosceptic opposition. So all these reasons bring into question this ability of European Union to pull informal but yet highly symbolical move that proves this ultimate leverage of its conditionality in the Western Balkans. So that's what I call Moses trap. Originally it claims all these copyright issues from the Bible. It's basically motive that want to say there is a one leader that leads rather authoritatively its nation towards the promised land, yet he himself or herself is not allowed to enter into European Union, into this promised land, right? So in more kind of scientific terms, we can say it's like zero-sum presupposition that the political elite or leadership or one person that led this with this authoritative hand, assertive strongman European integration process is necessarily along this process tainted, got corrupt in this transition period to be led to stay at the helm of his country following the accession. Therefore, according to various scenarios, he or she might get sacrificed to serve as a scapegoat to pull out this kind of symbolical step forward. So actually, these scenarios exist and can be traced to the closest example, Croatia, the country where I'm now. And it's the last, Croatia is the last country that entered European Union. And during this accession negotiation period, it had a symbolical level, this sacrificing of its lead Prime Minister Ivo Sanader, that is arguably undisputed leader of this European integration. He was basically charged over some corruption cases, and while charged, Croatia made this cathartic move, made this positive step forward, and finally let go through. Well, besides a person, it can be also argued the Moses trap is also meant not just for a person, but for a group. And in a certain sense, in Romania, we can see this certain phenomenon of having a strong anti-corruption campaign that sacked a certain group of people in charge of the country, right? So these are all from European perspective. However, the importance of this symbolical Moses trap is more on this demand side, right? From this local perspective. It is, as from the local angle, could be the silent chapter of the negotiation process that is ultimately facilitating this jump through, this springboard, this qualitative step. And now we are facing the period that itself it is being threatened to get vanished, right? So there are some example to this. For example, in the European Union losing the grip over politicians from Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia as well. So also it is cathartic equivalent to this complex conditionality narrative. In simple words, it is the visible part of this complex, someone might say like dull conditionality process. And I would like also to point out the importance of Moses Trap is the also that it's focused on this regime change promise or imperative. And we can also say it embodies or proves this synthesis of the pressure that comes from without and from within, from the public within the country and also from the European Union. So we can all argue that Croatia successfully went through this Moses Trap kind of issue. However, today the likelihood of the same scenario for these resilient Balkan leaders has been called into question. First of all, European Union is on this normative level further away from the Western Balkans. So the conditionality itself became more geopolitical, not more related to these internal issues. So compliance to this convergence to common European foreign policy is starting to get more importance, especially vis-a-vis some of these non-Western powers that are encroaching into Balkans, such as Russia, China, and to a certain extent it's also Turkey. Conditionality itself becomes more securitized, and on this like social level, identification process, if we argue from this colonialist paradigm, the self and the other in the perception of this local elites in the Western Balkan countries is getting more and more vrije. So this gradual de-othering is kind of the process of itself like halted, right? Stagnates or something, right? So to sum up this interplay between the resilient elites and the European conditionality, now it comes to the question we all have seen in the last maybe 4, 5, 6 years certain strategies to protract, to extend this transitional period. Now the question is, should these elites in the Balkans fully move to completely transcend and evade the conditionality itself by evading this Moses Trap? There are definitely 6 examples of different ways to evade this, but I have chosen this case of Montenegro. First of all, it is a country that is the first on a list to enter the European Union, the next one. And also it's a suitable example as this country only recently experienced regime change, or actually transfer of power, right? It has been said that from 1989, there is only one party ruling this country, and it also can be argued that this transfer of power may happen in Montenegro since the end of the Second World War. So following this August elections in this year, DPS, this ruling party, Democratic Party of Socialists, has lost the majority, and now this joint opposition is trying to form the government. And there are usually 4 scenarios put forward on how the next 4 years would look like in terms of this basic accommodation between still regime, right, and future opposition who will be in power. What is I will just brief you because it's rather kind of complex to state each of the scenarios. So there is this scenario that envisages this unstable opposition written by this internal contradictions, which exist on this pro-EU, pro-Serb, anti-EU, also attached to these religious issues. Then there is the other scenario on the different side that puts forward this game changer kind of thing that will happen in Montenegro, including complete lustration that is now becoming more and more kind of word of the day in Montenegrin politics. Also dismantling this whole DPS, this previous ruling party's the apparatus and political infrastructure they obtain in the administration, in state-owned enterprises, and so on. Also, there is a scenario that envisages this DPS standing side in the opposition, but still controlling these important levers in inciting social differences and cleavages and so on, being able to enter in the game and maybe provoke some sort of instability. And the fourth one actually mentioned this hibernating regime, the regime that decided to stay in the opposition, by its own time consolidating its position, and being able to stage a big comeback just before the first accession date in 2025, winning the elections, and then again be at the helm of the country before entering the European Union. In this way, it's can be argued it's like successful evasion of Moses' trap, because we will have a regime that is washed by, well, being allowed to allowing to this opposition to stay in power for a certain time, for 4 years, for one mandate, and then getting rid of this pressure to pull this regime change that has been going on coming from the European Union from the very beginning of this accession negotiation process. This kind of, I guess, scenario might be unique maybe for Montenegro, but actually there's many similarities in other Western Balkan countries having the similar scenario back before they accessed Europe. For example, Croatia, where ruling HDZ, Croatian Democratic Party, following the death of Tudjman, also had a similar case when it lost elections, stayed in opposition for quite what, for this 4 years. However, these important levers in administration and state-owned enterprises were held still by this kind of deep state that was still run by HDZ, right? So the likelihood that the DPS in Montenegro will still retain the power at such a deep state level is very high. And well, as a concluding remark, I would like to say that it would be interesting to see will this hibernating regime be eventually washed after 4 years, and will it be finally like Milo Djukanovic and this political elite in Montenegro will should we get into admit to avoid this Moses trap. But yeah, basically this is kind of the kernel of what I had thought to say, and for additional, I'm open for questions in the question and answer section.
Thank you very much. So the Moses trap comes straight out of the Bible. Moses got to see the promised land. He never got to walk on the promised land. And we just heard an analysis that pretty much focused on what we in international relations call the second level of analysis. In other words, a very sophisticated analysis of domestic politics as they relate to the Moses trap. Now we move to Professor Tzifakis, who needs little introduction, and he is efficient and successful, if nothing else. And he's going to be talking about EU accession conditionality hijacked in the Western Balkans. So we've already talked about defiance. Now we're going to talk about hijacking. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Professor Tziampiris. I have to admit that my title is in exaggeration, my original title. Having gone through this paper and preparing it, and having embedding it in a few ontological assumptions, I have come back. I think you are looking what I'm saying. I have come up with another title which has exactly the same content, but is embedded in theory. So what I'm going to discuss is about the blind spot in EU enlargement studies, and precisely the Western Balkans 6 inroads into accession conditionality and reverse conditionality. What is my argument? My argument is that the mainstream approach to EU enlargement problematizes, I tend to problematize the mainstream approach to EU enlargement, and showing that it is predominantly a unilinear process where its effects are almost exclusively observed in candidate member states in terms of their compliance or non-compliance with EU conditions. Drawing on the ontological assumptions of Giddens and Hay, I will try to present a typology of means through which the Western Balkan 6 countries actually strive to influence the EU enlargement institutional framework without eventually hijacking it, as I mentioned in the original title. Let's go very quickly to the next slides. There are several attempts of classifying the EU enlargement literature. The first generation of EU enlargement literature, we're seeing the process as very straightforward. It was based on the experience of Central Eastern European countries, where it was presumed that the EU, through accession conditionality, obtains the candidate member states' compliance. This was a structural approach, whether it was both drawing from institutionalism, whether rational or sociological, and it was explained either in terms of cost benefits, whether the offer was credible, consistent, whether there are some attempts to remark the importance of moments at which the EU exercises its gatekeeping capacity, such as opening accession negotiation chapters, and whether the communautaire acquis stick. The more sociological approaches have explained this process through the process of non-diffusion and social learning. Nevertheless, very quickly we'll talk with the Balkans that the process was not working as smoothly as expected. In that case, we have a second generation literature that has focused the agent on the Western Balkan countries and tries to examine their non-compliance. So the second generation literature is agent-centered and explains non-compliance by referring to the domestic political system, where you have authoritarian leaders, where the opposition is supportive, the compatibility of EU and norms and domestic practices. They have raised also questions of national identity, such as, for instance, Serbia's cooperation with ICTY, whether the countries such as Bosnia are ethnically divided, the fact that we have simultaneously a process of state building, or the cases such as Kosovo that has a contested statehood. And of course, the questions such as weak institutions, corruption, and state capture. So all these are agent-centered approach to explain non-compliance. On the question is, do Western Balkan countries or candidate members have any impact on the EU enlargement policy? The short answer has been no. No, because of the asymmetry of power between the EU institutions and the candidate countries. It's also because the Western Balkan countries do not have the institutional means to influence the process. However, some part of the literature, if I can request to close the mic for Professor Bakota. Thank you. However, a part of the literature has shown processes of policy learning operating, which have over time provoke a revision of the policy. For instance, we have a major revision of EU enlargement strategy in 2011-2012, where we went for the primacy of the rule of law chapters. The new enlargement strategy of 2018, which inter alia makes urgent the question of normalization of Kosovo-Serbia relations, and the new paper of 2020 that creates classes of chapters and reversibility of process. So summing up what we know so far, the process is mostly unilinear, with occasional incremental changes. The EU institutional structure is relatively immune to developments in the region. Although accession negotiation is perceived as an interactive process, revisions are occasionally affected through the instrument, through the means of policy learning, not by the dynamic of negotiations. And analytically, agency is limited as an object of study, in that case, the candidate member states, and what we're interested to know is the examination of the choice between compliance or non-compliance. The Western Balkan countries are examined as objects of observation, not as strategic interlocutors in negotiations, which somehow affect this process. So very briefly, I draw my work on the whole discussion on the ontology, precisely from Giddens and from Anthony Giddens and Colin Hay. What is the idea behind these works? The duality of structure, that the agency and the structure are not independently given, a dualism, but a duality. They are closely linked phenomena. The agents are knowledgeable actors who produce and reproduce structures. And of course, the structure, the strategic context is constraining, is guiding the agents towards a certain choice of actions, but at the end of the day, it doesn't determine their actions. They have the possibility to select a different course of action. So agents are perceived as conscious, reflexive actors, and with their strategic actions, with their choices, they are also reproducing structure. Bringing back this theoretical framework to our case, we end up thinking that the EU enlargement institutional framework and candidate member states are involved in a mutually constituted dialectic relationship. The EU has articulated a sophisticated system of external governance, which is a structure that strives to constrain and guide the action of Western Balkan countries. On the other hand, the candidate member states themselves are conscious and reflexive agents who voluntarily aspire to become EU members and render accession conditionality meaningful through their compliance. If the EU were to withdraw its membership offer, the Western Balkan countries will no longer feel bounded to observe policies of accession conditionality. And if the Western Balkan countries ceased complying with EU proposed reforms, the whole institutional framework will be void of meaning. So it is this mutual recognition of each other's co-constitutive role that objectifies this relation. Western Balkan countries have repeatedly, consciously ignored certain EU conditions, and this track record of non-compliance has affected revisions to the EU enlargement strategy through the policy learning, as it has already been acknowledged by other scholars before. However, in such dialectic relationships, the Western Balkan countries as agents are also quite expectedly and purposefully attempting to influence the content of the institutional framework. So the whole idea is here. How, at the end of the day, the Western Balkan 6 countries can impact upon the EU enlargement institutional framework. We said it already, it has been already mentioned. This is their non-compliance, affects policy learning in Brussels, and this causes a revision of the EU enlargement strategy. This is what has been called contradictory or unintended consequences. What I'm coming here to add is 2 more ways through which the Western Balkan countries are striving to influence the process. The first is to make inroads into accession conditionality by trying to change the definition and the order of priorities. And the second is by themselves, by what I call reverse conditionality, by themselves articulating binary choices to the EU and its member states and trying to capitalize on the EU fears. I'll give a very few examples within the short time that we have at our disposal to explain the last two cases. So, first of all, about attempts to make inroads into the definition of accession conditionality. I have kept three examples to explain here. The first is in Serbia, President Vučić, when he's saying himself that he puts priority to normalization of relations with Kosovo over the progress over the implementation of rule of law reforms. What is at question here is not the order of reforms, in which order these reforms will be implemented. It is much more about their gravity. This is not about a sequence of reforms, but about the gravity of its reforms. What Vučić implies, and this is a bargaining position towards Brussels, not towards Pristina, is that although my country is in democratic backsliding, or to put it politically correct, does not progress in democratic reforms, I'm expecting its EU accession process to advance because I'm keeping talking with Pristina and I'm maintaining stability in the region. Similarly, Tziampiris has prioritized the dialogue with Serbia over cooperation with the war crimes trials and the fight against corruption and organized crime. The same logic applies here. His negotiating position is not towards Belgrade, but towards Brussels. And what he's saying is that it's more important that we reach a deal with Belgrade, and I'll keep this area safe and without troubles for you. And I'm expecting to be rewarded for this, than to advance for the rest of the matters. And the last example by Djukanovic in Montenegro, where he has put the last year's emphasis on alignment with EU foreign policy decisions. Montenegro has 100% alignment with every single EU foreign policy decision over progress in rule of law and media freedom. So what happens here? This is not a selection of the sequence of reforms. This is an attempt to influence the impact, the gravity of each of these reforms, and trying to use those that they prefer as the vehicle for progress in their accession negotiations. The second example is what I mentioned, reverse conditionality, which is the Western Balkan countries creating discourses, articulating discourses with a binary choice towards the EU and its member states that have the following form. If the EU accession doesn't advance, Tziampiris and Rahman have agreed already from 2018 that they will pursue their union into a single state by 2025. This is not accidental if we see it as a scheme. This discourse was articulated following the publication of the 2018 EU enlargement strategy that precisely mentioned 2025 as the date in which the frontrunners may accede to the European Union. Likewise, Djukanovic again has repeatedly used these discourses, which also helped Montenegro to gain accession into NATO, that if we don't accede to the EU, if our EU accession does not advance, this area will fall under the influence of Russia and it will become a perpetuated conflict zone. So here he's playing on the fears of the West, which are very clear, of the region falling under the Russian influence, and his binary choice that he's presenting is an advancement of EU accession, or otherwise you'll see other actors playing a major role here. Likewise, Vučić has used the prospect of EU accession in a binary discourses with the advancement, with the strengthening of ties with Russia and China. So we see that in several occasions. I'm mentioning, for instance, in April, in the beginning of the COVID crisis, when he said that the EU solidarity is a fairy tale, and he went himself to welcome the aircraft with the Chinese assistance, with medical supplies. He's trying on several occasions to use binary schemes in which he's putting the EU versus these external actors, and he's trying to capitalize on the fears of the EU and its member states that the region will fall under the influence of other external powers. This is very powerful discourses. I'm just recalling that the President of the Commission, Ursula von Leyen, in her State of the Union address a month ago, she said that the Balkans is not a stopover to the Silk Road, which tells a lot, the fear of the EU that the region will fall under the influence of other countries. So very quickly, a few conclusions based on this presentation. The EU enlargement institutional framework and Western Balkans 6 are entangled in a dialectical relationship where structured agents are mutually constitutive. Nevertheless, there is, as it has already been acknowledged, an asymmetry of power between the two sides, and an asymmetry of capacity to create rules and norms that, and as a result, these asymmetries translate into a differential impact upon the process. I'm not claiming that the Western Balkan 6 countries can have or actually have the same impact to the process as EU members and Brussels. The process, the EU remains on the driver's seat and is driven by Brussels. So accession conditionality pushes the Western Balkan 6 towards reforms, but non-compliance is not uncommon. The Western Balkan 6 countries are adjusting to the process, they have learned its deficiencies, they are observing its policy inconsistencies, and seek to make inroads into accession conditionality, targeting at the order and definition of priorities. As for the politics of conditionality themselves, here they have been presented as a bidirectional process, where the Western Balkan 6 may also themselves articulate binary choices towards the EU and its member states in order to affect the latest calculus of their own calculus. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tzifakis. That was obviously a very sophisticated analysis. I think that you drove through the point that when we're talking about an accession process, it's a two-way street, or as you said it's dialectical. So the Western Balkan states are agents as well, and they have choices, and they're trying to adapt, but also trying to avoid certain things. You also made a very important argument that people tend to forget, that although, let's say, we have two sides, they're not of equal power or influence, and that is important to remember. And I wonder, actually, if the ideas by Western Balkan countries to pursue other options, China, Russia, are ways to compensate or address this power asymmetry within an increased conditionality where non-compliance may be, in certain cases, politically unavoidable. But we can pick this up in discussion. We now move to Marie Jelenka Kirchner and Zoran Nechev, the show behind the scenes, the impact of underlying domestic costs on EU conditionality compliance patterns in the Western Balkans. And I didn't read out your titles; they're on the program. But I love this show behind the scenes. I want to find out the backstage info. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Apologize first on behalf of Marie Jelenka. She got sick, so I will do the presentation. And thank you, Professor Tzifakis, for organizing all of this. I'm not at the point that Professor Tzifakis is with the research, so we are kind of at the beginning. So please, if you find any comments on the presentation or you have your own opinion and thoughts, please tell me and share it with me during the discussion. I will share the brief presentation now. Hopefully you can see it. Okay, can you see the presentation? Yeah, I can continue. Okay, so as the title says, the show behind the scenes, the impact of underlying domestic costs for compliance patterns of Western Balkan governments in EU enlargement. So what we have started in our research, we have first started with the lessons learned from the Big Bang enlargement to Central and Eastern European countries, and we have tried to find out, is there a relevance for the existing models on the impact of conditionality, or we can use the same models, the same variables and factors that are considered relevant for the Southeast European, for Central and Eastern European enlargement, are also important for explaining the compliance with the acquis in the Western Balkans. So what we have started in our research is that the enlargement strategy puts an increased emphasis on rule of law and resolution of bilateral issues. The existing models are developed based on the Eastern enlargement, but they fall short on some of the variables. What we have decided to look upon in this paper is on the domestic cost or the adoption cost and the actors involved. So in addition to the patterns of compliance, underlying dynamics of actors' commitment must be thoroughly analyzed. So the theoretical model that we have based our research on is the external incentive model of Europeanization, developed by Schimmelpfennig and Sedlmayr. It's an actor-centered rational choice bargaining model or a strategy at both sides. If with varying incentives and motivation, these two scholars managed to present a comprehensive model to explain why and how conditionality can be successful. Their external incentive model, augmented by the assumption of social learning model, as well as the lessons drawing model, provided researchers in the field of EU enlargement a reliable model or method to understand the dynamics, both negative and positive, of the accession process. If we put it in a nutshell, the external incentive model assumes a set of factors relevant for the successful accession of the Western Balkan countries to the European Union, some of which apply to the EU side and some apply to the candidate countries. And these are the four seen here in the presentation. That's the determinacy of EU condition, the credibility of accession, capacity of candidate countries, and domestic political costs. The key assumption to this model is that both bargaining sides base their strategy on their own interest. And as such, the accession builds theoretically upon a system of a compromise and mutual convergence. So what we are seeing here, that the whole compliance is understood as an adoption of EU rules and their translation into domestic rules. And we have provided here a list of ways of compliance. So that's the discursive adoption, the formal adoption, and behavioral adoption. As Schimmelpfennig and all mentioned before in their piece, compliance is based on commitment. The stronger the identification of the target government with the EU, the more likely conditionality will be effective. However, in order to get the full picture of challenges in the Western Balkan accession process, the commitments need to be further analyzed. And this is what we have started doing with this paper. Briefly, I will present the main arguments and the preliminary conclusions, and I will stop here. So there are two prevailing arguments. One is the weak commitment by the Western Balkan target governments compared to the Central and Eastern European enlargement. And weak incentives eventually strengthens authoritarian tendencies in this country. And this also the previous two speakers have mentioned this. That's the first underlying argument. The second one is there are two factors for the divergence between the compliance and commitment. The first one is credibility at the side of the European Union. So what we are increasingly seeing is a nationalization of the EU enlargement process as such. And the second one is the significant increase of veto culture among member states based on bilateral disputes with Western Balkan accession countries. Here, it is very important to be mentioned that there are numerous bilateral issues which are not among the Western Balkan countries themselves, but they are also with the neighboring EU member states. So this is very important to to understand. And we have the case of North Macedonia is a prime example. Previously, because of the name issue, with Greece, stagnation for almost 10 years, and now once that one is resolved, we have newest tendencies with Bulgaria over other bilateral issues. That we can also mention. We can also mention Serbia and Croatia. The Serbs have been caught in a trap for opening the accession chapter 23 for almost a year because of a blockage by Croatia. We have seen it before in the case between Slovenia, member state, and Croatia, when Croatia was actually a candidate country. And most recently, although not part of the accession process as such, but is still very relevant and important, that's the Kosovo and the visa liberalization issue. So you see there are a couple of examples here. In the last case with Kosovo, even we have a positive assessment by the European Commission. It is blocked in the Council. That's the first key factor, and the second key factor is the adoption or political costs of government actors in candidate countries. So here I just want to explain that there is a high price to pay, but there is a low return of investment, as we have seen it in the case of North Macedonia. But not only that, we have rising Euroscepticism in certain countries in the region, Serbia primarily, but also Montenegro and North Macedonia. Although here we are not talking about, still the percentages are quite high, but still there is a significant decrease or rise Euroscepticism in these countries. Just to go a little bit more in the arguments. So for the first one, commitments versus incentives, candidate countries are reluctant to undertake bold steps that might jeopardize their survival on the political scene. And we can take an example here with our former prime minister or the current president of Serbia. Even if there is a political will, the outcome is not secured and the reward is unclear and insufficient. So the whole thing is based on a promise that if you resolved certain political issue, which will cost you a lot domestically, you will only get a promise that something will get better. And here we again can take the example of North Macedonia and Serbia. In the case of North Macedonia, there was a success in the negotiation with Greece, with a promise that once we resolve that, we will open accession negotiations, so the Council will give a green light to open the process. But now we are seeing that the negotiations are stuck in the Council. It might not be started for a certain period of time because of problems with Bulgaria. The second one is Serbia. According to President Vučić, he has to pay a significant price in order to fulfill, let's say, the accession promise. And that's primarily related to Kosovo and not that much on rule of law issues. And finally, remaining in power. The consequences of this is that remaining in power remains the primary issue for the governments in the Western Balkans, fortifying their dominant position in the country and control over institutional and state resources. Something which is quite known in the annual reports of the Commission recently, and enlargement strategy, something that is coined, a word that is coined state state capture. On the second argument, so as we have mentioned, there are two key factors that have direct effect on the divergence. The first one is credibility. In comparison to the Central and Eastern European countries or the previous enlargement rounds, the Western Balkan countries now are exposed to much stricter conditionality framework. And there is a significant trend towards veto power and bilateral issues, which are incremental in the accession, in the EU enlargement decision-making process. So it's becoming more like a threat in the process than something that can push the countries forward. On the second key factor, the adoption or political cost of government actors in candidate countries, the Western Balkan countries are among the poorest countries in Europe, with a weak administrative capacity to adjust to EU standards. So if we translated this to compliance effects, we can mention that even if there is a compliance, at least technically, that the countries are aligned with the EU acquis, most of the time implementation is lacking. Or there is unwillingness by the elites, the political elites, to implement certain EU rules and regulations. And the second one, the public opinion on EU membership has been marked by growing trends towards Euroscepticism. This goes for the 4 countries in the Western Balkans, with the exception of Kosovo and Albania. So, what are the preliminary findings and conclusions? They're still preliminary. We are still discussing it. So that's why I think that it will be really nice if we can hear the opinion of the others. Domestic cost, especially hidden ones, or elements of it, needs in the regional external incentive model provided by Schimmelfenning, in order to be applied to the Western Balkans, needs much needed revision. Domestic costs are multi-layered more than it was previously envisaged or presented. And here we can, here we want to portray that officially most of the countries go in dialogue in resolving the issues, especially bilateral ones. But we can question the interest and the willingness to really resolve it. If we take the case of North Macedonia and Greece, there was a dialogue already in the times, well, since forever, but since the discussion. Since the positive recommendation in 2009 by the European Commission to open accession negotiation, there has been dialogue on various levels between the governments, but we can question how sincere and how regional they were, regardless if they were on a high level or political level or technical. And why we are saying that it's multi-layered, sometimes compromise is irrational. So if we have a rational, because we're talking about rational model, if we look at the gains or what are the rewards for resolving certain issues, if we have rational actors, sometimes compromise looks very irrational. And the third and last preliminary finding is that that faking compliance is becoming a real challenge to understand non-compliance with EU conditionality. And this goes back to what I have said before on really aligning the legislation with the EU, but actually not implementing, although the levels of compliance is quite high. I will stop here and would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think that you actually built upon what Professor Tzifakis pointed out, being the non-compliance. And I think you made an argument that non-compliance, or compliance rather, could entail a high political cost. I'm reminded of Lyndon Johnson, who, when he passed the seminal civil rights legislation, he was quoted as saying that his party, the Democratic Party, would lose the South for a generation, which is exactly what happened. So what you're saying is you have non-compliance because there's going to be a steep political cost on the one side, and on the other side, political leaders, even if they're willing to accept this cost, do not know if they're going to make it to the EU, when they're going to make it to the EU, and what the EU will look like then. So in that sense, it's I think you're arguing there's a rational, from a political perspective or a partisan perspective, or a career personal perspective dimension to non-compliance. So the plot actually thickens, and we have more to discuss. Now, we turn to Simona Vaskevichuete, and if I mispronounce your last names, my name is Tziampiris. It's also very tough. Apologies. Elena Stupinskine, assessing reconciliation in Croatia, moving forward or backward. Feel free to correct the pronunciation of your last names. And let's see, are we are we moving forward or backward? It's a clear-cut question. Let's see if the answer is clear-cut as well. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. Actually, you were pretty clear about our surnames. Yes, I will share my screen. If you can see it. So before starting, it is really worth to mention that this research is still in progress, and in the future we would like to publish it as an academic article. Therefore, all the advice and remarks from you are highly welcomed. This paper provides an assessment of reconciliation in Croatia before and after the accession to the European Union. As you are well aware, due to such a recent history of conflict in the region of Western Balkans, the European approach towards future membership was based on the usual and additional conditionalities which should have eventually led to the national reconciliation. Although EU has never provided an official definition of reconciliation, but we can deduce from the instruments it advocated that it was primarily about re-establishing political stability and normalizing the relations between the states that have been involved in war. The existing literature on the effectiveness of EU conditionality policy in Croatia points to the fact that the progress was limited. However, a comprehensive analysis and comparison of reconciliation in the period before and after the accession remains absent, meaning that we are not really sure whether Croatia is now dealing with the simple case of the slow progress of reconciliation or a regress of it. That is why this paper aims to assess reconciliation levels in Croatia before and after the EU accession. In order to do so, we firstly define and operationalize the concept of reconciliation. Then, using the case study method, we conduct the assessment of reconciliation levels, focusing on the acknowledgement of past wrongdoings, active engagement with the past, good neighborly relations with Serbia, and inter-ethnic relationship inside Croatia. After that, we draw conclusions about the progress made. Reconciliation actually is one of the most debated concepts in the field of transitional justice, and there have been well over 60 definitions of reconciliation just in the political science literature. However, analysis of the predominant trends in the existing definitions demonstrates that the majority of authors tend to describe reconciliation as thick rather than thin, where thin reconciliation is understood as coexistence and thick reconciliation is understood as restoration of broken relationships. Taking this trend into account, we chose to use a thick definition provided by Karen Brunos, who sees reconciliation as a societal process that involves mutual acknowledgement of past suffering and the changing of destructive attitudes and behavior into constructive relationships toward sustainable peace. This definition actually covers significant characteristics of reconciliation, such as responsibility and acknowledgement of wrongdoings of the conflict, restoration of inter-ethnic relationships, and active dealing with the past. Taking these characteristics into account, we identified several important reconciliation elements that were used for the assessment of reconciliation in Croatia. So the first is political leaders and society are taking responsibility for the past. So examples or evidence of this could include public symbolic acts, attitudes, and beliefs about the conflict that express acknowledgement and regret of the harm done. The second is the country is actively engaging with the past. So official efforts to achieve a balanced understanding of history represent political determination to deal with the past, and it is linked to the acknowledgement of past wrongdoings because it shows the readiness to accept the truth. The third is good neighborly relations with former enemy state. It shows that the legacy of the previous conflict no longer influences bilateral relations, meaning that the mutual acknowledgement of past suffering and constructive inter-ethnic relations are present. And finally, the status of inter-ethnic relations is good. This element indicates that discrimination and hatred are limited to rare incidents, and society in general maintains a constructive attitude towards the other. These actually, in order to assess the level of reconciliation, these elements of reconciliation have to be operationalized. It means that measurable indicators of each of those elements have to be determined. Moreover, we have also determined what kind of evidence and examples have to be found in every indicator in order to assess whether those indicators are present or not. But due to the time restrictions, I will not go into these details, but we can provide this information later if needed. So, in order to assess whether Croatian political leaders and society are taking responsibility for the past, we have to find that Croatian political leaders are acknowledging Croatia's active role in the conflict and taking responsibility for atrocities committed. During the national commemorations, politicians honor all victims of the conflict. Glorification of war criminals, rare and not officially sanctioned. And political leaders and society accept the legitimacy of the ICTY decisions. The second element, the country is actively engaging with the past, is measured by these indicators: national efforts to deal with impunity for war crimes, official truth-seeking efforts, history education reforms, and balanced ethnically inclusive and active policy of memorialization. To identify whether Croatia has good neighborly relations with Serbia, we search for indicators like border disputes are solved or marginal. There is active cooperation in the field of transitional justice. Bilateral relations are productive and cooperative. And finally, the element of good inter-ethnic relations is measured through these indicators, like public opinion and attitudes towards Serbian ethnic group are good. Incidents of ethnic tensions during national commemorations are minor. Proactive efforts to improve the legal protection of ethnic minorities, and finally, effective investigation of nationalistic and hate crimes against Croatian Serbs. So, as Croatia entered the EU in July 2013, these elements and indicators of reconciliation were analyzed during two periods. The first one is pre-accession period, so from 2005 until July 2013, and then post-accession period, which is like from July 2013 until 2020. Within these timeframes, the data was collected from various sources, starting with reports from international institutions and other non-governmental organizations. These institutions provide a comprehensive and reliable information regarding the majority of before mentioned indicators. Moreover, secondary sources like academic books and articles were used to cover actually the progress in certain areas which were not actually covered by the reports. And finally, news reports, mainly from BalkanInsight.com, were used because it provides the information about Croatia's political and societal development at the time of specific events. Moreover, it demonstrates the key examples of assessed reconciliation indicators. This website is considered as a reliable source because it focuses on topics related to transitional justice, and also it covers the most important events related to reconciliation. So after a detailed analysis of reconciliation levels in Croatia prior and after the EU accession, the findings demonstrate that Croatia was never fully reconciled. However, before the EU accession, Croatia exhibited thin to mid levels of reconciliation that started visibly deteriorating afterwards, meaning that there were deeper societal issues that remained unresolved during the accession process. So for Croatian politicians, reconciliation became not a matter of moral choice, but like a practical political strategy. So tensions have resurfaced as soon as the external pressure was gone and Croatia's progress stopped being monitored by the EU. Croatia's refusal to take responsibility for the past wrongdoings has intensified, engagement with the past became weaker, inter-ethnic relations with Serbian ethnic group have gotten much worse, and bilateral relations between Croatia and Serbia remain difficult. This research calls into question the overall effectiveness of the external pressure to reconcile after violent ethnic conflict. Moreover, it adds up to the criticism that EU conditionality policy was limited and failed to produce sustainable impact. Due to such findings, we consider that there is a need for a change in the current European approach towards reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have two major takeaways. One is you actually very wisely provided a definition, a working, sophisticated definition of what reconciliation is and means. A lot of people throw out this word, but what is it? So that was very helpful. But I think you also provided some evidence that once accession has happened, if certain processes have not been completed by then there's rationally there's much less political incentive to pursue them, which actually is in support, I think, and this is where we can start discussing, of the EU's increased conditionality requirements. If, for example, it is correct what you say that after accession, things sort of like didn't really progress much, and there was no incentive to, or much of an incentive, then I wonder if you're suggesting that the European Union is onto something in its approach in increasing the requirements of conditionality. Though at the same time, we also heard presentations saying that this might be might lead to other outcomes or not a accession. So now I want to ask Professor Tzifakis if we can take some questions, or how do you want to proceed?
I think that we'll have some time for a few questions. If you want yourself, it's via YouTube, they can contact from the audience. So if you want yourself to ask a question, very short to each speaker.
Right. I actually have a question. We now have a lot of polls, so I want to poll the participants and ask them, since you're experts on the Western Balkans, does anyone consider realistic an accession of a Western Balkan state by 2025? And if yes or no, why? Because remember, we have the pandemic, we have a date, we have goals, we have conditions, but in your analysis, do you think that this is even remotely or likely a possibility? And we can start, whoever wants to go first.
No, I can start and I can share my opinion. Realistically, as the process is organized for the time being, the short answer to your question will be no. Even optimistically, realistically, the answer is no. Just in order to enter, you need at least let's put it like this, 2 years of process of approval, the accession treaty by all the member states. And this takes around 2 years. So that means that the accession negotiation should end by 2023. And this is impossible to happen in the next 3 years. There is a novelty. There is a new accession negotiation strategy, which changes and updates the process significantly. Now you'll no longer negotiate by chapters, but you negotiate by clusters, and the two front runners in this case, Serbia and Montenegro, has also approved to go under this new methodology. It was devised to be approved or to start with North Macedonia and Albania. However, the Commission also requested that or find a way how to include Serbia and Montenegro under this new condition. So the answer will be no.
I will agree with Zoran, if I may take the floor. There is, in fact, an increased tension between accession conditionality and its results. The stricter it has, as Zoran said, the stricter it has become conditionality, the less consistent has become over time, because countries are advancing in institutional steps towards membership without really making progress. We're desperately trying to find a success story. We thought the success story was North Macedonia since Zoran Zaev's first election in his country, but now we see again with Bulgaria's obsession over the question of the language that even that case won't advance so smoothly. So 2025 scenario is a missed date already. And if I may add, the only reason that the European Commission pronounced 2025, it is because it was convenient for them in terms of European elections, a new incoming parliament, a new incoming commission, a new framework of financing these countries. So it was bureaucratically convenient, the 2025 as a year, but it was not realistic at that moment and much less realistic now.
Does anyone else want to have a go at this question?
If I may add just a few words to this, it should be pointed out that from the very beginning, when this date was announced, was kind of announced in a really negative way. So it was not said like 2025 would be the first, 2025 would be the first date. It's actually, they actually said, I believe it was like 2 years ago, that before that there won't be any. It's certain that won't be any accession, right? So it's kind of implied that not even after that date any new accession should be expected. And well, I can brief you like on the this sort of media analysis after this news came out, like in Montenegro, Serbia, and so on. From the very beginning, they were also really certain that this date was just like given, you know, in spec, while no one, not even politicians, were so you know, optimist in going out with claims that the country, Serbia or Montenegro, could join the European Union in 2025. So realistically, they already 2 years ago, when this thing was announced, thought, okay, probably in best scenario, maybe we should expect like 2027 or something like that to join the European. And this is also the most optimistic kind of scenario.
And based on what was said today, Keynes famously was quoted by saying, in the long run, we're all dead. And if we have a process, if you're a politician today, or if you're a citizen today, and you're saying, I'm going to take the political cost now, and maybe 7 or 10 years, which almost certainly I'm not going to be in my position of power, if this, this is how usually democratic societies work, someone else will reap the rewards. I can see how the rationale works against resolving the thorny issues now, if we're talking 7, 10 years down the road. And there's also the uncertainty. I think it's very fair to question what kind of European Union will have 7 or 10 years down the road. It's a process. I think the European Union is redefining a lot of its policies and its identity, really. So this panel is very, very good, but I think it's fair to say it's not very optimistic, but that is a way of saying it's very realistic. I was wondering if anyone from the panel would like to ask any questions between all of you. I think we've reached a certain level. Yes.
Hi everyone. I'd like to ask one question. I was very, very intrigued by Professor Tzifakis' presentation. I found the Gideon scheme used very appropriately in a very interesting way to explain how there's an interaction between the Western Balkan states and the EU enlargement policy. But while doing your research, did you come across any successful examples where they managed to change something, where this actually works? Because I can see it as a strategy, as an attempt, right? But was it successful in any instances?
Thanks for the question. I'll give 2 very brief answers. The first is my first intention was analytically to give room for this part of the missing scheme, because so far the discussion is the process is presented, as I mentioned at the beginning, unilinear. So the process cannot be linear in any way. Of course, their impact is marginal. Giving them, putting them inside, mapping them out, is the right word. Mapping them out in the scheme doesn't mean that they are very influential or equivalent to the EU. Their success so far has been what I said earlier, that although there is lack of real or genuine progress and in the terms of implementation of reforms during the last decade, several reports and watchdogs remark a backsliding since 2009, 2010. At the same moment, they are making forward steps in the EU accession process, because the EU has bought into the argument that we should give them something, we should reward something. And this is because the real dilemma is not the one between comply with this EU accession requirement or stay in a stagnant position, but the real dilemma is what we want from the region. And the region says, I presume, towards Brussels, I presume that you want stability. And I presume that what you want in the region is no conflicts, no Russian, Chinese, or Turkey, or whoever else is coming here. And by putting these binary schemes implicitly or explicitly, the EU is biting and is returning with rewards. Of course, they will not become EU members without a substantial amount of compliance. But we cannot longer neglect that it is a negotiation. They are part of this equation, and they are having some impact in the process. This was my intention. Otherwise, I don't expect Montenegro or any country, not to name anyone, to accede as it stands today.
Great. I think that all the presentations taken together provide a sophisticated understanding of what is a very complex, dialectical, dynamic, long-term process. And I think whoever has actually listened or watched us is better off because he or she now understands much better. And even if they say that a pessimist is a well-informed optimist, and there might be a pessimistic tinge, but I think it's the realism in your presentation. So I think we can end, Professor Tzifakis, I think we can end this panel right here. It has been a privilege and great fun for me, actually, to chair this panel. And I'm sure in coming years, we will have more conferences on the Western Balkans accession process and EU conditionality. So thank you very much, everyone.